Okay, well, I think I'm gonna just go ahead and get started with some introductions for us tonight so we can begin the presentation. So thank you for everyone zooming in from where you're located. As I said, feel free to put that in the chat and how many people you are. Wonderful to see people from different states zooming in tonight. That's a lot of fun. So we do appreciate that and you letting us know. I'm Angelica Diggs, so I'm the executive director here at the Montclair History Center. We've been doing these history at home presentations since COVID, and Elaine, I think, has been on almost every single one,
Yep.
uh, listening along with us. So we're thrilled to have her here this evening. Elaine has joined us as a local historian with Montclair's Swedish-American heritage. Elaine was born here, raised, and a lifelong resident of Montclair. She is a Montclair High School class of 1961, Montclair State College 1965, and also former high school teacher. So Elaine married someone from Montclair and is the mother of two sons who grew up in Montclair. So this is a true through and through Montclair family. She is an avid genealogist, researcher, has done work with us as well and producing content. And as Elaine told us, 100% Nordic on her DNA. So I know this is a passion project that Elaine has put so much effort into her family's research and Montclair's Swedish heritage. So we're really excited. This is the first time we're doing such a presentation on this heritage. So I'm going to now put myself on mute and hand it off to Elaine. And everyone just feel free to use the chat, and then we can unmute at the end and do live Q&A, or I can read questions from the chat as you like. But otherwise, I'm going to hand it off to you, Elaine. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to do this. I've really enjoyed it. Got into some things that I didn't know before, some people that I had forgotten about. So we'll get started and see what we can do. So tonight we're going to look a little bit at the history of Swedish immigration, as well as some of the key people in Montclair, because we have to understand why they came here. What was their reasoning? And there are so many Swedes with people who have roots in the town. So if I've left out your relative, we don't have time to cover them all, or we'd be here all night. So who were these people? They were young, they were single, they were educated, they were eager to learn, and they were really upstanding citizens that came to Montclair. Well, why did they come? They wanted freedom and they wanted a future. They wanted to be what they wanted to be, and they wanted to be independent. So what did they do? They built the town, literally with their hands. They built it and they served in many, many ways. They gave other people jobs. And so how do we remember them? We remember them by their houses, what they built, their families, and the heritage that they left behind. Before we go any farther, we have to do a little bit about immigration and figure out what was going on in the world, in the Nordic world. Well, as you can see here, the Norwegians in the Viking world, they went west. The Norwegians were the ones that went to Iceland, Greenland, and then came along into the North American coastline. So they were kind of on their own. They went down into Scotland and Ireland, down the British Isles, and then they wandered down into the Mediterranean. But the Swedish people, the Swedish Vikings, they went through the Baltic, and then they went along the Volga and the Dnieper River and down into the Arab countries, actually, and had a completely different route. But the reason, why did they go? Well, they went to trade, but they had nothing to trade with. So in order to trade for what they wanted fur, they wanted silver, they wanted silk, they wanted luxury goods. Well, if you don't have anything to trade, what do? You steal. So you go through and you plunder things that you can trade and take back to your country. So they were not exactly the wanted people that came through. And then they became mercenaries. They hired themselves out so they could go fight people and get paid for that. And they took slaves, which was rather sad. And I think they left their DNA quite a few places along, because as people are having their DNA tested, they're finding Swedish DNA. And they said the only reason they could get that is if some Viking left their DNA behind, and I'm sure they did. They got down as far as Constantinople, and they think there's a rumor going around that that's where they picked up the recipe for Swedish meatballs, because they found that they thought they were pretty good, so they took the recipe home. So they may not be totally Swedish. So they were plunderers, and they traded. They were into commerce. They terrorized people terribly, and the children prayed before they went to bed, God save us from the Vikings. And that was the start of the immigration when they went back and forth. Here are some of the pictures of some of the tools that they had. You know what is missing? It's one thing missing, and that's that little hat with the horns sticking out, because they never had the horns on their hats. That would have been a real bother to them. They would have gotten caught, and it just was not practical. So where did the hat with the little horns come from? That came from 1870, when the Wagnerian ring cycle operas were being performed, and a costume designer thought it was cute to make a horned hat for them, and then it became a comic symbol and was not the Vikings at all. But we've got to get the Vikings now to the New World. So the Swedes came in, and they decided, you know what, the English are in the New World, the Dutch are in the New World, and we want to be a part of that too. So they hired a Dutchman named Peter Minuit, or Minuet, whatever you want to say it, to head their company, the New Swedish Company, in 1638. And they loaded up some ships, 2 ships from Sweden in 1643, and they went up the Delaware Bay, and they had a whole bunch of Swedes and Finns. The Finnish people wanted to come. They were called the Forest Finns, and they were from the northern part of Sweden. And they also came then with Lutheran clergy. They had to have the Lutheran pastors with them. So they come and sail up into Delaware Bay. They had a governor named Johann Prince, and he thought he was going to really be something in the New World. Well, didn't really turn out that way. They built a couple of forts, then they built some more forts, they built some towns, and this Governor Prince built himself a huge, fancy manor house on an island called Tinicum Island in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And he brought things from Sweden. He brought draperies and silks and gold and silver, and the Native Americans thought he was hilarious, because this Mr. Prince weighed almost 400 pounds, and the Lenni Lenape Indians that got along very well with the Swedes laughed at him, and they called him Big Belly. So they built a mill. They built 2 beautiful, beautiful churches, which have been replicated later, one outside of Philadelphia and one in Newcastle, Wilmington, Delaware area. So they were trading very peacefully with the Indians, the Lenni Lenapes, the Native Americans. They were trading with other colonies. It was very peaceful. But then Sweden had problems at home, so they stopped sending supplies and ships, and the people were stranded. 700 Swedes had come to the colony, and they were farming and getting along fine. But the Sweden cut off their supplies, wouldn't send the ships. The Dutch were taking their beavers, and it was not a good situation. So they petitioned Governor Prince to get out of the new colony, and they sent him back to Sweden. But Sweden thought he was pretty good. They made him a general in their army, and then in this country he's been memorialized in Delaware and Pennsylvania, but he had his problems. Then the Dutch started fighting with the English in 1654, and in 1655 the English took over the Dutch colony, and the Swedes had to leave. So they fled to southern New Jersey. They went to Swedesboro and Vineland down in Gloucester and Cumberland County, and they were gone. It was a very big disappointment to them, because they had really planned to make it big in America, and they didn't. But they left two things behind. They left the log cabin, the cabin that you think of when you think of the pioneers and going west. That was the log cabin. They think even maybe Abe Lincoln was born in a Swedish log cabin. And the French had tried to build a cabin, but they put their poles and their wood up and down vertically, and they fell over. So the Swedes thought it'd be better to put a foundation and put the logs horizontally, and the log cabin as we know it was born. Then they also left the Lutheran pastors behind, and so Lutheranism came into the New World. And that was Sweden was the last of the European empires to be founded in America, and is also the shortest lived. So they went back, and that was the end of the new Swedish colony. Never got anywhere. So bringing it up to closer to the modern days now, leaving Sweden. When you were going to leave, it was a big thing because you were going into the unknown, and maybe you'd never see your family again. You're going to a new country, new customs, new language, new nationalities that you had never met before. Most of the people were from 15 to 35 years old, and they were single when they came. So when did they come? Well, they started coming about 1850, and then the era of mass immigration was over by 1930. Not that more people didn't come, but they dribbled in after that. Wasn't major. 1.5 million Swedes left their homeland. That is 1/5 of the whole population of Sweden left. They went to the USA, they went to Australia, and they went to Canada. So 10%, only 10% of the Swedish immigrants ended up on the East Coast, from Maine down to Philadelphia generally. Otherwise, they went to the Midwest, Northwest, even to Texas, and sometimes whole villages emptied. Well, what was the push for the immigration? Why did they want to leave? Well, for one thing, unemployment was high, very, very high. 90% of the Swedish people in the 1800s were peasants, and they were just downright poor. And there was a strange kind of a system. They were called crofters or cottagers, or in Swedish, the topar, and there were 100,000 of these people. Now, what were they? They were tenant farmers. They paid rent for their small plot of land and a little cottage, but their rent was not in money. It was in hours that they would labor for the landowner, so on the main estate. So they didn't really have any chance to get anywhere, to save any money, or they had big families, and they were just downright poor. There were 5 classes of people in the 1800s in Sweden. There was the crown. If you were royalty, you had it made. You had a castle, you had land, you had horses, you had anything you wanted if you were the crown. Now, next below that was the nobles. The nobility had titles, but they had inherited them, and they at least maybe had a manor house, they had land, and they had a job. They weren't too concerned about their conditions. Then you had the craftsmen or the independents that had been able to buy a house and some land. They were your school teachers, tailors, dressmakers, shoemakers, just people who kept the economy going. And they were a little bit better off. Then you had the next class down, where a man had the cottagers, the one we talked about before, where they would never own the land, and all they had to do was work for another man, the owner of the property. Sometimes a few of these houses ended up close together, and they had a little mini village, which was good for them because they could just grow their own food, what they needed, and they had each other for support. Then there was the last group, which was called the Bakstuga. These people lived in hovels. They were little cottages that were actually sometimes pushed into the side of the mountain, and with sod roof, and just downright poor. Well, the whole system of not owning your land, working for somebody else, it was almost like a sort of a slave labor situation. It was outlawed in 1943, so it lasted a long time. But still, there were bleak rural conditions. Crops were failing. One year they had so much rain they didn't know what to do. The next 2 years they had almost no rain. The population was growing. There were too many people. They had gotten rid of smallpox by making vaccinations mandatory, and they would check every year to make sure everybody in the family had been vaccinated against smallpox. The farmland in Sweden is generally poor. Like my grandfather used to say, you can't grow rocks, because that's really what they had. They may have had a few cows, some wheat, some rye, some oats, some fruit, potatoes. Potatoes were a big thing. And there's a lot of forest area. Couldn't do much in the Northland with the forest unless you were logging. But I put on here this section of Sweden. The southern section is called Småland. Now, if you've been to IKEA, you know that Småland is where you send the kids to play while you go shopping, because it means a small place, small land. And it's a really the most populous area for the tourists. If you want to go to see the really classic Sweden, you go to Småland, and that's where most of the people came from. So they didn't have much to work with, really. Small farms, nothing much. There was a class society too. There was a lot of injustice in the classes. There was no hope to get out of where you were. If you were the crown, the nobility, and the rest of the people were commoners. So there was a great lack of faith in the future of Sweden for the moment. Maybe you wanted to avoid military service, so you could leave your homeland, take your chances. Then there was religious persecution. We don't think much about Sweden as being a persecution type of situation, but it was. The Lutheran Church was the state church. They had all the control. The government outlawed immigration. You couldn't emigrate. You couldn't leave the country until 1830. If you tried to leave, it was a criminal offense. People didn't want to have that happen. The Lutheran Church kept on preaching that leaving your country was a sin, and the people were scared. They didn't want to leave because they believed what their Lutheran pastor had said, and they were very repressed in their desire to leave. But then there were a group of people called the Pietists who were independent. They were the house churches. They were called readers because they said, you know what? We don't want to be told what we can read and how we can understand our Bibles. We want to read it for ourselves. The Lutheran Church didn't like that, but they couldn't do much about it except preach against them and said, if you weren't Lutherans, you shouldn't be reading your Bible. We'll tell you what to believe. So there was snobbery, complete snobbery by the monarchy. But because they didn't want to lose their cottagers, they didn't want to lose these people that were working on the farms. So they were rather mean to them because they said, well, if you leave, you're going to get punished. Everything's going to be bad. So the little red cottages in Sweden were the result of people leaving. They did leave. And Sweden has really a very good reputation now as far as what is left. Things have changed. There's not like it was in the 1850s. So you go to Sweden, you see the little red cottages, the lakes, and I'm sure you've been to IKEA sometime. That's where the homeland of it is, down here in the southern part of Småland. And you know the name Husqvarna. The children love Pippi Longstocking, Ingrid Lindgren's book. The candy cane was invented by Amalia Eriksson in 1859 in Grana, down here in Småland. So the Christmas candy cane, that was her invention. Then we have glass blowing. You have the Orifors, the Boda, the Costa. They've been going since the 1800s. Yeah. And in spite of all those things, people wanted to leave. So what brought them to the United States? Free land, the promise of free land and they were in really getting excited about going because people called agents put up posters and they put up ads, come to America and this is your future, you can come. And they had letters from people who had emigrated say, oh, it's wonderful in America, come to America. This is what we're doing so well. We have opportunities and you should come. So they thought, well, maybe it'd be a good idea to leave. And if immigration was getting very organized in both in Sweden and in the USA, and the waves of people started to come. Before 1830, rare. During the Civil War, people didn't want to come to the United States, but in 1890, they poured into the United States. 800,000 people came to the US in the 1890s. Slowed down a little bit, World War I. Sweden was very disturbed. The mid-20s, no mass immigration. Sweden was doing better. The quotas weren't even filled. The Canard lines started in 1840 to 1900, brought 2.5 million immigrants into the United States. White Star Line, Inman, it got cheaper and it got faster. And then in the 1960s, it slowed down and then it just had a little bump when Volvo and IKEA brought people in to run their offices here. And that was the last, really, it was a Swedish immigration. And in this country, really around here, it's kind of fun to, have you ever been, maybe if you're local anyway, I'll give a little plug for the Swedish Women's Educational Association. Every year at the end of November, they have a fair, usually at the Commonwealth Club in Upper Montclair. So if you want a little bit of taste of Sweden, watch out for the SWIA advertisements. Well, here the people are. They're going to leave the family. They're going to leave what they know. They're going to travel from Sweden to the United States, to America. How are they going to do it? Well, the first thing they had to do is they had to register with their local Lutheran parish to tell them that they're going to leave. And then they could change their name. If they wanted to Americanize it, then that was where they would do it. If your name were Johan Johansson, you could be John Johnson. Or you could, there were so many common names that they said, I'm going to Americanize it. That's where it could start. Then you travel to your port. You went to Gothenburg, Malmo, even Oslo, and you bought a ticket. And you bought a ticket there to go all the way to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, wherever you were going to go. You had to fill out all kinds of forms. You had to have your name the way you wanted to travel. You know, it's like male, female, married, single, your age, your birthplace, a name of somebody in America who would vouch for you and be there to meet you, or a name of the person in Sweden in case something happened to you. They wanted to know you, notify your family, have to give that name, who bought your ticket, how much money were you traveling with, and then did you look like you were healthy enough to come. So welcome to America. All right, you've gotten yourself down to Gothenburg now. You're going to get on a ship. You've been provided with a place to stay in case you needed to stay a few days. You could have a boarding house or a hotel. Now you've gotten your ticket. You get on a boat run by the Wilson Line, and you are going to travel to Hull, England. You have 40 to 50 hours on the ship. You leave on a Friday afternoon from Gothenburg. These ships took 600 people at a time, and you would land in Hull on a Monday morning. The trains were going to take you to Liverpool, and the train tracks would come right up to the pier so that the train would be waiting for the people. They got on, and about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, they were in Liverpool. There was the ship waiting for you. Now, if you were wealthy, you got first class or second class. But the immigrants cost them a year's salary to travel. They couldn't afford it. So they were in steerage, which was the bottom of the ship. Steerage is where the rudders and the hull, every underneath the hull would be steering the ship. So they called it steerage. 1,000 passengers, up to 1,000 passengers plus freight and mail were on these ships. They met nationalities they had never seen before, languages they had never heard before. They poured onto these ships, and it took them at least 5 days to get to Ellis Island. Well, they saw the Statue of Liberty from 1886 on, and if they came before Ellis Island, 1892, they had to go to Castle Garden down at the southern tip of the Battery in New York, or they could go to a local port, and the state officials would accept them through the local port. Well, what was the process like? It was scary for many of them. The ship would dock at its pier, the Cunard Line pier or whatever they came on. The first and second class passengers got off immediately. They were given a 30-second check, and they looked healthy. They were lawyers and clergymen and doctors and salesmen, and there was no reason to keep them on the ship. Get them off as fast as possible. Sometimes they had 5 ships a day coming in with passengers. It was just too much to check everybody. First and class passengers get off, get on their way. They had been able to pay, so they were considered good. So they were gone. Now the steerage passengers had to get on ferries to go to Ellis Island. It took 3 to 5 hours to process them at Ellis Island. And then they would be put back on a ferry to the city, get on a train or another ferry if they're going to New Jersey, meet their family or friends if they were there. There were always somebody to help them. And the poor people were scared, because if they were from Sweden, there really wasn't any problem, because they had been carefully checked before they even bought their ticket. And there was something called a manifest list, and that is where everything was put onto paper, carefully copied by clerks. Again, if you hear that somebody had their name changed at Ellis Island, that's an urban legend. It's a myth. Nobody's name was ever changed at Ellis Island. They changed it when they bought their ticket, or they could change it when they came to the United States up till 1906 with no paperwork. You just changed your name to anything you wanted it to be. So Ellis Island did not change a name. So they had, when they got there, they were into Ellis Island, they were greeted by agents who spoke their language. Every agent had to speak English and at least one other language. And most of the agents spoke up to 3 languages, because a third of them had been immigrants themselves. There were so many opportunities to get things right. The agent checked off their name from the manifest. They were divided into language groups, and the captain or the master of the ship had to sign off on the manifest to be sure everyone was accounted for. If he missed somebody, they got in trouble. So there's only been one case of a name being wrong. Some girl gave a maiden name or a nickname, didn't match, they couldn't find the name. It's the only time they ever had a documented case. Then they were given a health check, a very quick health check, because the Swedes had already been checked in Sweden, and they got through very quickly. Some of the other people that came from other Eastern European countries and everything, they were held at Ellis Island. They were well taken care of, but they couldn't be released until they passed their health exam. But the Swedes were in good condition. And the ship wanted you to be in good condition, because if they had to send you back, the shipping company had to pay your fare, and the companies didn't want to do that. So as an example, I'm not sure if anybody of you have ever seen a ship's manifest. Maybe you haven't. This one happens to be a Cunard Line ship, and it was the Bothnia, sailed from Liverpool. in March 13th of 1896, and it went to Boston. It took them 13 days because they had to stop in Ireland and pick up some more passengers. This happens to be for one of the carpenters that came to Montclair. I just happened to pick his manifest here. They gave your name, whether male or female, what was your occupation, could you read or write, where'd you come from, what was your hometown, where were you going, do you have a ticket to go all the way to New York? Yes. Who paid for your ticket? You did? Okay. How much money are you carrying? $10, $5? Have you been here before? No. Who's going to meet you? Are you a polygamist? Are you handicapped? Can you work? All of these things had been checked off in Sweden when they left, so the Swedes were in good shape. Then the master of the ship signed, the doctor on the ship had to sign, and the everything was checked out at Ellis Island. And so you got a good idea of where they were going. All right, we have left Ellis Island. We are now in Montclair. You got off the ship, you took the ferry to Hoboken, you got on the train, and you ended up maybe Lackawanna Station in Montclair. Well, people were coming in very fast, and every group seemed to have somebody that was like an angel for them that they depended on. Well, Montclair had a man by the name of Charles Wilbur Sanford, and he was an insurance man in Newark. He lived on Claremont Avenue, and he had every office imaginable in the First Presbyterian Church in Montclair. And he noticed that the Swedes were coming, and he had a heart for the stranger in town. And he felt a great need to help these people because he felt they were lost. They were young and single, looking for work, had nobody. And Montclair had a problem back there in the early 1890s because they had 40 taverns or saloons in a little town of Montclair. And Mr. Sanford and Father Mendel of the Immaculate Conception Church had a campaign to get rid of the 40 saloons. They managed to get them down to 8 and put them all on a main street so the police could watch for fights and drunkenness and all the things that went along. But Mr. Sanford, he said, I don't want my Swedish friends going to saloons, so I'm going to go out of my way to do what I did for the African American people in town. He had formed a Sunday school class for African Americans, and it became St. Mark's Methodist Church on Bloomfield Avenue, the oldest church building in town. And in 1880, when the church was founded, he was so happy that he had been able to help the African American community. And that church is still going, the St. Mark's Methodist on Elm Street. So he invited his Swedish people, I imagine with somebody who knew English as well. He invited them to come to a Sunday school class just for them. He invited them to come to the First Presbyterian Church on Friday evenings, where they had services in Swedish. He had groups come to his home. He taught them English. He taught them Bible studies. He found that these people had been well trained in their Bible knowledge, and they needed that English, and they needed the socialization. So he was just really their hero, because he really put them together in the Swedish church society that they needed. When he passed away in 1924, it was really a great loss to the town. So we have now them gathering, and we can't talk about the immigrants in Montclair without talking about their churches. He formed the Swedish Mission Society this is the Presbyterian Church down, the mother church of so many of the churches in town, and it stood where the Hink building, we call the Hink building now, on Church Street and Bloomfield Avenue, comes to a corner there. And that stood there till 1913. But from this Swedish Mission Society, they had a wonderful time, and they decided, you know what? We don't need to be a mission society. We want to be a church. So the men, mostly the men, there were ladies involved too, but the men got together and they said, okay, let's start a church. This is about 1892, 93. And they said, what kind of church will we have? Well, they had a fight. What was the fight over? The fight over was over water. Now you say, how in the world could churches fight over water? Well, one group said, well, we're Lutherans. We should take and we must baptize our babies immediately as soon as we can because we want to christen them and we want only infant baptism as our main rite of baptism. The Swedes that were Baptists said, no, 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 can't do that. Can't do that. We must have a believer's baptism when a child is old enough to say that they want to be baptized and be immersed completely as Baptists. And we don't want to be Lutherans. We want to be Baptists. We should have a Baptist church. The third group came along and said, no, we are free church people. We say the Bible doesn't say that you must be baptized in a certain way. So we're going to leave it up to the families. If you want to baptize your child, fine. If you want to wait till they're older, when they've been through confirmation, that's fine too. But we're not going to have anything that says this is what you have to do. Okay, we have now 3 groups. Instead of one nice big church, we have 3 groups. Then independently, the Salvation Army came along to town. There were Salvationists in Sweden. They sent a corps out to Montclair, and they had an independent church, the Salvation Army. So we have 3 churches. First one, just talk a little bit about the largest one, was St. Eric's Swedish Evangelical Lutheran Church. That was on Glenridge Avenue, not too far from the Forest Street area. They met in that church building from 1895 until 1961. It was a carpenter stick construction. When they left in 1961, the church was sold to another, I think, a Seventh-day Adventist church. They were there for a while, and then it got abandoned, completely abandoned. It was falling apart, and it was threatened to be torn down. And a developer came along and said, you know what? I'm going to restore this church. And he did a beautiful, beautiful job on it. And back in about 2024, I guess they finally finished it. And it is now an apothecary store, the House Freya. And you can go there for your lotions and your potions. And it's worth a trip just to go in and see. He restored it beautifully, taking as many of the church elements as he could. And it saved it from destruction. So that was really a good thing that happened to that church. So in 1961, they built their new church sort of across from the high school, a few houses down from George Innes, and they're still there as First Lutheran Church. The next one were the Swedish Baptists. They went over to Trinity Place off Church Street, and they built their little white church there, and they stopped Swedish language preaching and everything in the mid-30s, early 30s, like everyone else did, and they became Bethel Baptist Church, and they were there until 1965. They merged with Pleasantdale Baptist in West Orange, and they formed the West Essex Baptist Church, and then they built a new church, which is now the Crossing in Livingston. So they found it was the urban squeeze, the lack of parking was starting to get to them too. Their congregation was moving out of Montclair, like many of the younger people moving out to more of the western suburbs and all. So they decided it was best to close and to merge. So then we have the church with the most names. And this was my church, my family's church. And they started out as a Swedish Mission church, and they said, no, we're going to be a congregational church. They received their mortgage through Dr. Amory Bradford, who was pastor of the First Congregational Church. And he also got them a little stipend to help pay their pastor. So they said, okay, we're going to be the Swedish Congregational Church. And they held that name for many years until 1930s when they stopped Swedish services, and they called themselves now the Valley Road Congregational Church. And then the group that they belonged to was a group of Swedish churches from Maine to Philadelphia called the Eastern Missionary Association, and that group merged with the Covenant, Evangelical Covenant Church of America. So Valley Road had paid off their mortgage. They didn't like the congregational denomination, and they said, no, we're going to join the Evangelical Covenant Church. They changed their name to Valley Road Covenant Church, and then later took the denominational name of Evangelical Covenant Church of Montclair. Well, they, in 2013, after remodeling in the 50s, doing very well, they too felt the squeeze. There was no parking on Sunday morning because there were 4 or 5 churches all competing, plus the restaurants that had started to open up on Sunday morning for brunch, and it was just impossible. Hurricane Irene came along, and Hurricane Irene destroyed all of the Sunday school rooms, the basement flooded underneath the foundations, and it was just impossible to repair, even with insurance. So the church closed in 2013 and was sold, and I honestly can't tell you what's in there now. I don't think there's anything, and I don't know what has happened to the building. Then we have, this is the inside of the original church. It was called Carpenter Gothic, and the men built it themselves in one summer by digging the foundation. They were all carpenters. They gave their free time, and they built a nice little church. And there's a picture of some of the early people in the church there. Then we have the Salvation Army, who had come to town for us with a Scandinavian Corps. They spoke Swedish. They had their services in Swedish for quite a while. And they came about 1907, really organized. And then they built their church on Glenridge Avenue in 1912. And it looks like a little armory. You can see the tops there of the building. They wanted to have their own style. They were there from 1912 until 1966, when they bought the Swedish Baptist Church, the Bethel Baptist Church, after they had moved, and they moved themselves to Trinity Place. And then in 1990, they had pretty well dropped all the Scandinavian association too, and they built their beautiful new building on Trinity Place on the same spot. They tore down the church, they took the pastor's house next door and a couple other houses, and today they are in a fully functioning, beautiful place there in Trinity Place. Well, now we've gotten all the Swedes in their churches, but they didn't have resentment against each other. They worked together, and what did they do? They really were enthused about the town, and they were carpenters, coachmen, chauffeurs, gardeners, domestic servants, governesses, waitresses, cooks, laundresses, dressmakers, bakers, mechanics, and sextons. They loved the town because there were so many people that have written diaries and everything, and they had an equality that they never knew in Sweden. They had the freedom to do what they want, go where they wanted. They were treated so well by their employers. The employers valued them tremendously. They had an opportunity for upward mobility. They could get a better job if they wanted one. The ladies were so impressed the way the American men treated their women. That was one thing they commented over and over again, how they were just so respected, and they had a sense of community. It was all new to them when they came. They worshiped together as they wanted. And one thing that they really enjoyed, a boss and an employee could be on the same church board. They could be trustees and elders, and their value, the employees' opinion was valued as just as much as the boss's was, and they worked on the same level, and they thought that was really great. They were a happy bunch of people. The wives, when the men got married, of course, as time went on, and the wives supported each other. They supported their men. The women had their ladies' societies, their ladies' circles, mission-minded people. The ladies used to love to knit and sew for the poor, and very mission-minded people. They loved two-family homes because they had support. They had somebody to watch the kids, and the ladies got together all the time. Some of the men liked the fraternal orders. Quite a few of them were Masons, and they just loved Montclair. One of the pictures here was marked the Swedish Church Men's Chorus. They loved to sing. The Swedes have always been really, really good, and they loved their hymns. They loved their songs. They always had a string band, which I called Swedish bluegrass, because they played their violins, they had guitars, and they just had a wonderful time. And they had a great love for their new country and their new town. So let's talk about some of the people now who were the heroes among the Swedish immigrants. First of all, this is Mr. John Severin Carlson. Severin means strong, severe, and austere, very common middle name for a lot of the men. And he was born in 1859, one of the older ones that came to town. He had a very good common education in Sweden, probably up to what we would consider maybe 8th grade. He had apprenticed in carpentry and the building trades in Sweden. He had mastered workmanship, very high quality, one of 8 children. Well, he left Sweden in May of 1881 with his father. His father's name was Carl Peter Anderson. Of course, John was a Carl's son because they had the name where you took your father's name and put son or daughter at the end. So John Severin Carlson and his father, Carl Peter Anderson, came. But they didn't come to Montclair. They came to Western New York, probably Jamestown, where most of the Swedes were coming. And they worked there for about a year. His father's goal was to make enough money to send for his wife and the other 7 children that were still in Sweden. So that was the way he was going to do it. So they worked there for a year. Then they went to Western Pennsylvania, in the Warren, Pennsylvania area, where the railroad was doing a lot of construction. Well, unfortunately, his father died in a horrible accident. Apparently, we think he probably fell off a ladder with its internal injuries, and he died a day later. And of course, John was devastated because this was a major tragedy, to think that his mother and his siblings were back in Sweden and he could do nothing. So his father was only 40 years old too when he passed away. So John came to Montclair, and he worked for a carpenter, a well-known carpenter, one of the oldest builders, Edwin Dodd, and he worked for 4 years for him. He was working then, and when Mr. Dodd retired, he worked for Peterson and Dedig, and he bought them out in 1899. And he started his own company, the J.S. Carlson Company. His brother Ludwig came to Montclair, and between the two of them, they constructed over 200 buildings in town. The Carlson Company was well known. If you can read them all, you can start. If you're a local person, you'll know what the Montclair YMCA, the Georgia School, Hillside School, on and on and on, built all of these buildings with the name of the Carlson Company. He decided to run for town commissioner in 1920, and this was what they said about him. He was prompt, he was faithful, and he was thoroughly, it's just really an honest man, unqualified confidence of the people. self-made man, industrial, and so forth. But he lost by 100 votes, so he did not become a town councilman at that time. But he did become one of the most prominent citizens of Montclair. So John S. Carlson and his brother Ludwig, good men. Here is Oscar Peterson. He was known by in his contemporaries as OA, and he came first of all from Sweden. He was a farm boy. His father was a farmer, and he really didn't have any construction ability at that time. But he came first to Pennsylvania. He went out to Titusville. I don't know why. We don't know exactly why he ended up there. But then he came to Montclair, and he began to be interested in construction. And he didn't know much about construction. There's one story that people were telling that a person that was thinking about hiring him, he was, a young man at that time, and the man said to him, "Can you hang a door?" And OA looked and said, "Yes, yes." And he said, "Okay, you can come to work for me." Well, afterwards they said to Oscar, they said, you don't know how to hang a door. Why did you say you can hang it?" He says, "Well, I can hang a door." He said, "He didn't ask me if I knew how to hang a door. So I went and studied doors, and I learned how to hang a door. But so now I can say, yes, I know how to hang a door." And he had quite a sense of humor sometimes when things like that came along. Well, his construction company went into a lot of the commercial buildings, hospitals and churches, St. Valentine's and St. Thomas churches, and St. Cashin School, the Grace Presbyterian Sampson Education Building, the Temple Shamre Imuna, and many other commercial buildings. So here we have the very young O.A. Peterson. For when you came to this country, the first thing you did, you bought a suit and a tie, and you had your picture taken. So then you would send that back home to have your people see how well you were doing. And there he is with his family, and then an older picture of him in 1963. He passed away in 1972. I know his grandkids are on here tonight. He was a really fun man to know. He was my great uncle, and he came to this country, and everybody bought a bicycle, but no, OA didn't want a bicycle. He bought himself an Indian motorcycle, not a Harley, but an Indian. And he rode that around town until his wife finally said, "I don't think that's such a good idea. I think that you should give up your motorcycle." So he did. And he always loved his cars. He had a Packard or a Cadillac, and he loved anything with a motor, whether it's a boat or a car or anything. And then during the Depression, he had some fun because in around 1930s, and people were looking for things to do. So miniature golf became a big thing in town, and he opened a miniature golf course with his friend George Engstrom and his architect friend Arthur Rampurst, and they had a beautiful mini golf course on Church Street. They had torn down a building and they put up a golf course, and everybody loved it. It had lawns and trees and hazards and stucco office building, and really pleasant, and it was a big hit. Around the corner was his biggest competitor, the little Jack Horner golf course across from the YMCA. And that was run for the summer by a manager, a young man making money for college, and his name was Clary Anderson, who went on to be Montclair's greatest football coach ever. So he got his start at the golf course. Then 1947, the Peterson Company remodeled Hampton House, and you can see that today, put a Art Deco covering on the outside, and still there today. So now the company established in 1914, a fourth generation as a family-owned and operated organization. So let's go through some of the other ones, other buildings. This is his home on Central Avenue, and Temple Shamre Imuna and St. Cashin School. Those were his big contributions, really. And the most famous one was the home of Kurt Forstmann, called Cobble Court. It's on Upper Mountain Avenue. It's a beautiful, beautiful manor house built in 1932. Got its name Cobble Court because of the cobblestone driveway that came through. And that was one of his beautiful buildings. Now, S.A. Benson, my grandfather, he was not a major builder in town. He worked originally with O.A. Peterson, but they had very different opinions and ideas in running a building, and they kind of separated. And Swen Benson went to Sweden for a year, and then he came back in 1920, 22 or so, and really started his own company. And I just wanted to show you quickly here. This is a place that most people don't know about. This is the Chestnut Hill Nursery. It was on Harrison Avenue across from what is now Nishawane Park. And they supplied all the trees and the plants and the vines and the flowers, everything you needed for your property. And they had been in business since about 1850. They sold a special manure, and it was they called it vegetarian manure, and it was $2 for a 200-pound bag, and it sold very, very well. And so they supplied everything in Montclair. Well, the two brothers, Edmund and J.C., one of them passed away, the other retired and passed away. So their property was up for sale, and S.A. Benson bought the whole property for $60,000, which was quite a bit in 1926. He divided it into 18 parcels, put in 2 streets, North Brookwood Drive and South Brookwood Drive, named it Brookwood because that was the original name of the whole property of Stephen Carey from Orange Road up to Eagle Rock Way, and he honored that family by using the name Brookwood. If you ever have a chance, drive by, go up in North and South Brookwood Drive. They're beautiful houses. He sold some of the properties to other builders, built some houses himself, and there were 18 homes on that property. And that's the way a contractor came into town and developed. We have George Engstrom, who was born in Pennsylvania of immigrant parents, and I consider him one of the Swedish builders, though. He came to Montclair and did a lot of building in town, and that was another 3-generation business that he ran, his son ran, and then his grandson, until George retired and they closed the building company down. Well, he developed Chester Road with O.A. Peterson. They were going to put in a lot of houses. It's just north of Watchung Avenue, and they had big plans, but something came along. The Essex County said, you can't buy the land because we're taking it. We're going to put a park in. And so your roads can come up to our property, and the roads, Chester Road and Mount Vernon Road, never got completely finished because Brookdale Park was built at the end of the road. But they did a very nice job, and that's a couple of streets I would also recommend you drive by. He took the Greenview Way area, did the same thing as S.A. Benson did, bought some of the property that had been the Upper Montclair Country Club, and then the Elm Brook Country Club for a while. And when those areas were sold, the carpenters came in and developed Greenview, Fairview, and Club Road, and built beautiful, beautiful homes. He did some work at Mount Hebron Cemetery for their building and built many homes in town, and was also very active in the bank. And they did something really unique in 1935. The banks in town were concerned because the carpenters and contractors were tearing down houses that were only 20 and 30 years old. And instead of remodeling them and modernizing them, they're tearing them down. The bank said, you can't do this because these houses have good bones. We're going to try something new. This was the first time that a house had been what we call now flipped. A contractor came in, fixed it all up, modernized it, and resold it. So George Engstrom was the carpenter for this one on Midland Avenue, and they went in completely, brought electricity in, modern heating, plumbing, everything, and showed that it could be done without tearing the house down. Carl Gustafson was a painter in town. We'll get to him later. And all the hardware was done by Victor Carlson, the son of Ludwig Carlson, the builder. And the architect was Arthur Ramphurst of miniature golf fame, great architect in town. That house sold instantly as soon as it went on the market, and it's still there today. Beautiful. Anders Wickstrom, he unfortunately died only at the age of 45. He built the most beautiful houses in town. This one on Edgemont Road, another one on Lorraine Avenue. If he had lived, he would have been famous all over because he was one of the best contractors in town, and came from Sweden as an immigrant, started out very young, and built this beautiful house in 1914 on Upper Mountain, and 1917 another beautiful one on South Mountain. They were huge houses. They've been enlarged and remodeled a little bit since, but they are wonderful, wonderful houses. And he was just stunning in his work. All right, Brewer Widmar. Brewer means brother, so Brother Widmar built 300 houses in town, in Montclair and right around town. He was another one that came into the golf course section, developed the fairway and Belgrove Drive. I'm sure if you are local, look around at some of those houses someday when you're traveling. Also built the Gordon Hurst Village Apartments. Now, apartments in Upper Montclair were unheard of in the late 40s. And without, of course, in Montclair, everybody said, not in my backyard. You're not building those apartments. Well, he did. He built these beautiful apartments, which are still very popular today. And they go from Park Street to Valley Road, kind of tucked in there. And it was a real asset to Upper Montclair. But people in Montclair have been very vocal. They didn't want it. But he said, we're going to go. We're going to do it. And also the Bellevue Apartments across from St. Cashin Church in Upper Montclair, they were his works too. Now you have a few other people that were not builders. Where did you go when you wanted to buy a car? Well, you went to people who spoke your language. And these were Swedish people who did a lot for the town in that way. John Swenson sold Nash cars, new ones, used ones, all kinds of cars. He sold, apparently, from what they can figure out, 4,000 cars in his days as being a car salesman. And he offered cars during the Depression that you could buy from him, 1/3 down, 12 months to pay the rest. He sold loads of cars. It was very good to his customers. Then if you have a car dealership, you have to have some place to repair. So he opened Park Street Garage, which was across from what is now American Hardware at Watchung Plaza. And he put a couple of Swedish people in there as mechanics, and you could go and you could discuss the cars in your own language, and people thought that was great. He ran a taxi service. You could almost like an Uber. You called him, he sent a man with a car, took you where you wanted to go. He tried to run a little bus service from Watchung Avenue, across Montclair Avenue, Greenwood Avenue, to the station, up Bloomfield Avenue, and back to the Park Street station. And that ran for a couple of years. Then he finally gave up on that. And so he did very well for himself in town. And then you had to go to Elmer's. If you wanted Scandinavian things, you went to Elmer's. And Elmer came through Boston from Sweden. He was a machinist for quite a while. And then he was manager of several independent little franchise stores for foods and groceries and so forth. And he opened up his own store, and we all loved Elmer. I remember Elmer very well. He had a wonderful smile, and he was always dressed in his white apron, and he would sell you all kinds of groceries and Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, whatever Nordic food you liked, you could get it. In his store, he had for an island in the middle, he had a big boat. It was just full of all kinds of great stuff. And I know a lot of people that are on tonight probably went to Elmer's. He lived to be 104, retired down in Florida, and he was just the jolliest man. The ladies used to laugh at him because they'd call him and say, Elmer, you sold me a bag of flour, and when I opened it up, it had bugs in it. And Elmer would smile and he'd say, did I charge you for them? And the ladies would say, oh, Elmer. And then they'd go on with their shopping. His sidekick was Joe Petronassi, who would deliver your groceries right to your door. And everybody loved Elmer. And he was a great guy, really. Something that Montclair would be proud of. And then you wanted to go out for a quick meal. Anderson's Tea Room on Bloomfield Avenue. It's a Japanese restaurant today next to Diamond Cycle. And Gustav and Ada would treat you well. I remember eating there a few times when I was little. And they had the best pastries, and he was a great baker and would bake you a great birthday cake, or he did wedding cakes. And he was in business for about 25 years on Bloomfield Avenue. And then you need to find a job. Well, Hulda Stenstrom would take care of you. She was in charge of she had a Swedish employment office. She had another sad problem too, because she was born in Sweden. She came with her family, one of the few families that came to New York City. Her father was a tailor, and she grew up in the city, married John Stenstrom in 1885, and they had 2 boys and 2 girls. The youngest one was about 3 years old when her husband passed away. She didn't know what to do, so she packed up her children and took them to Montclair, and she opened an employment agency, and she could work from home. She could be there for her kids, and it was unusual in those days to work from home and be a lady in business like that. She was very, very well liked. She took care of all the Swedish girls that came to town. If they wanted a job, or if they needed to have a new job, wanted to get a better job, they went to Mrs. Stenstrom. And so the old, reliable Swede was still doing business. She was on Walnut Street in North Fullerton and moved around a lot, but everybody liked Mrs. Stenstrom. And the little baby that she's holding there in her picture is her granddaughter, Jane, who would have been 100 years old if she had lived, but she passed away last December. So Jane, I think, had a lot of personality like her grandma, Mrs. Stenstrom. The next one, we're getting almost to the end here of all our people. If you needed a good friend, you went to see Eva Christina Johnson. Now, she was another one that had come through some sorrow, because she was born in Sweden in 1850, and she got married in 1878, and they had a son. She married Anders Johnson. They had a son, Carl, the year later. Well, they'd only been married 3 years, and Anders, her husband, dies. And 2 years later, her little boy dies. So what was she going to do? She had nothing. So she decided she would come to America all by herself. She settled in Montclair. She worked for the Board of Education. She bought the land next to the Swedish Congregational Church. And she heard that the Munn Tavern, the old Munn Tavern on Church Street, was going to be torn down if it wasn't sold. So she had this piece of property. She had the Munn Tavern moved behind the church over to her property, and she lived there. And she lived on the 2nd and 3rd floor and rented out the 1st floor. And she took in girls to board while they were waiting to get a job. And in 1924, she gave her front yard to become the yard where they could build a pastor a beautiful home, which is still standing there, 19 Valley Road. In 1929, she willed her her house, the old Munn Tavern, if she could live there until she died, which she did, and the church used it for fellowship room, kitchen, and Sunday school rooms. And then the whole property was sold, and I know it was turned into a townhouse, and I don't know anything more about its condition today. They called her Mor Stina, which was Mother Stina, and everybody loved her. There was a quote from my mom there in 1980. She was a very dear soul and quite a character, which apparently she was from what we hear. Then one other lady here is Charlotte Louisa Carlson, called her Louisa. She was the sister of John S. and Ludwig Carlson, one that came one by one. The children came from Sweden, and her mother came a bit eventually, and they were reunited. Well, here she came at 16. By age of 23, she was running a boarding house. She took in Swedish carpenters and other men. She gave them breakfast, she packed their lunch, she gave them dinner, and she had a couple of her siblings living there. Her mother came to help her. Well, she got tired of that. She was quite the entrepreneur though at 23. So she heard that the local St. Vincent's Foundling Asylum on Elm Street had started a program for girls who wanted to take up infant care training. So she joined the hospital and she graduated in 1904, and she got a job for whatever reason in Omaha, Nebraska. We're not quite sure what the connection was there, but when she left, the pastor in the Swedish Congregational Church said it was a great loss to lose Louisa. So she went out there to Nebraska. She met Selma Sandberg, became her friend, and Selma said, well, maybe you'd like to meet my brother, Alex. He's a farmer out in the country. Well, she met Alex. They hit it off. She married him in 1906. They had 5 children, but the farm failed, and Alex didn't know what to do. They sold everything off, and she persuaded him to take the family and move back to New Jersey, which they did. They lost their daughter at 17, but her 4 sons did very well for themselves. 3 of them worked for corporations, and her youngest son, Clarence, became the well-loved president of the Montclair Savings Bank for many years. And they both passed rather young, 1939 and 1948. People say, did the Swedes have a neighborhood? No, they did not. They were not like the Italians. They didn't have a neighborhood, but they lived on Walnut Street and North Fullerton, Forest Street. They especially liked this stretch of houses that are across from the Renaissance that ran playing fields, and some contractors just lived in their own houses until they were finished and ready to be sold. Carl Gustafson, remarkable painter, was the one that took part in that restoration of a house, the flipping of a house, and he really was very, very good at painting. He had a brother who could match colors. Amazing. You give John Gustafson a piece of wallpaper, and he said, I need some trim paint. That man could match a color exactly without today's computer systems. He had a great eye for color. So Carl did very well. In fact, our town historian, Mike Farrelly, featured his house on High Terrace a few issues back in Montclair Neighbors, if you are interested, if you remember that. Then if you needed to get a ticket to go home, you wanted to go to Sweden, visit your family, you went to Samuel Lundberg. He was a letter carrier in Montclair for a long time. He played the organ at the Swedish Baptist Church, Bethel Baptist Church, for 42 years, and he was a fantastic salesman for Swedish-American line and could get you a ticket for anywhere you wanted to go. He was a silent partner in Meyer and Lundquist, the morticians in town. And then we have 2 more people. We have the Rostrom, Mr. Rostrom, who built stairs. You know, Montclair is famous for their carpentry inside, and he was the one that built staircases, gorgeous staircases with newel posts and railings and spindles, and all the carpenters went to him and got their cabinets and their stairs from him. He had 3 sons and 6 daughters, and you can imagine all of the newspaper was full of engagements and weddings from the Rostrom kids. Moline and Kronberg, another store that's still going on. They've been going on since 1911. Then Philemon Moline and John Kronberg got together and said, you know what? There's a need for a good tailoring and cleaning business in town. And the two of them worked for a long time on Valley Road. They built their own building on Lorraine Avenue. They're still there. It's been sold by, run by other people now. But the three of them, I said, must have been quite a thing because Philemon Moline was a Swedish Baptist. John Cronenberg was a Swedish Lutheran. And when Mr. Moline was going to retire, they hired Fridtjof Johnson, who was a Swedish Congregationalist. And I said, I wonder if they still discovered that they had differences in water, but I think they probably got along pretty well all through there. And our last group now is Frank Danielson, the tailor on Grove Street. Again, very, very popular man. He ran his business for 50 years. Well, his family took over after he passed away, but they had a couple different locations on Grove Street, and he did an excellent job. And some of you were going to ask, well, wasn't there a Swedish restaurant in town called Three Crowns? Yes, Three Crowns was in the basement of the Claridge Theater in the Hink building for many, many years, from 1944 to 1980. Mr. Nils Sandberg had come from New York City, and where he'd had a restaurant, and he opened up the Three Crowns, what had been Grill Lyon, and it was a big success, and he had various managers working for him. And look at that price on the turkey dinner. Thanksgiving, all the trimmings, $2.75 in 1949. Bring 10 people with you, you could cut your own turkey. And they were famous for their smorgasbord, $2.50 for everything you could eat. And they had a piano lounge and a very popular place until the Claridge said, well, we don't want you here anymore. We're going to renovate. You're going to have to close down. So they did. Shortly after, a restaurant named Class Reunion came in, did not do very well, and they closed. So I don't think there's much in there in the basement right now. And finally, your days have come, and you need an undertaker. You went to Mayer and Lundquist, serviced all the Swedish families in town, along with a couple others. Everybody loved Meyer Lundquist. The Lundquist was a silent partner, the same man who was the letter carrier and sold you tickets to go to Sweden. And he was just a really good partner for them. They were German people, the Meyers. And then 99, I'm sure about 99 or 90% of the Swedes are buried in Mount Hebron Cemetery. And that was the place of choice for everybody. So that brings us to the end. We've run over our little hour, but I hope you have had gotten a good sense of what the Swedes did. You can be, if you have Swedish roots, you can be very proud of the Swedes in Montclair. They were wonderful people. I couldn't find any reports of anybody ever getting in trouble, and so they really were a group that Montclair can be very proud of. So I'll turn it back to Angelica. You can take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. That was wonderful. A lot of things I did not know and learned for the first time. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I just want to take a minute and let anyone who wants to unmute or in the chat put a question, or if you'd like to say anything with Elaine, just feel free to do that.
Elaine, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a joy to do it. It really was.
And I did see one thing in the chat. Eric had said a bit earlier on, Mr. Carlson, who was the treasurer of Uppsala College, Orange, he said, is there any other aspects about its founding, although now no longer in existence, if you knew?
All I know, it was a Lutheran college, and I really don't know anything about it. It was very basically, Swedish influence, and sent out a lot of Swedish pastors and professors from Uppsala, but I can't tell you much about it.
Thanks, Elaine. I was so impressed when you said over 300 homes built. I feel like that's something probably no one realizes in Montclair. That's a pretty amazing fact. The carpentry contributions in the building that went on here in Montclair, that's impressive.
Absolutely. And during the Depression, they were building 100 houses a year when
Wow.
other town they weren't that affected by the depression, but the contractors kept right on going. And
Wow.
they're good houses. If you live in a Swedish carpenter house, you've got a good house.
Yeah. That's pretty amazing.
I wish I had one, but I don't.
Anyone on here who lives in Montclair know if they have a Swedish built home? You might have to find out. You can come uh, do some research with us. Any questions? Anything anyone would like to ask?
I have a question. Very little of the Swedish history is written in any of the Montclair history books. And I
Mm,
wonder why that has occurred. It was never, and obviously it was a very prominent and resourceful community with the buildings they built. I know as a realtor, I remember reading the Youngstroms were involved in construction. Any building they ever touched was always of high esteem. Um, and somehow that's, I can't think of the main history book that was written, but there's never any mention of any of the Swedish people in that. And I wonder why.
It's a it's a good question. I think probably from what, as we've experienced at the History Center, often sometimes the history of other cultures, say like Swedish or Italian, et cetera, are not often they're not as documented.
Mhm.
And it sounds like Elaine might be on the start of a mission to help us document more of this. So,
That's true. They were basically just good hard workers, and they were undocumented as far as they just took for granted that they were doing a good job, and
yeah,
they
yeah.
didn't they didn't very humble people.
Yeah, so I feel like it's a history that has not been fully written about and certainly needs to be. Pretty amazing stuff, and I'm sure there's so much more out there, even beyond all the
No,
fascinating things we got to hear tonight.
right. That is interesting because it is the lower middle class that was working as in these houses as I remember seeing ads. I think the Montclair History Center had ads, newspaper ads asking for house cleaners, and the women were working as domestics, and the men were carpenters. They were building
Hmm.
many
Hmm.
of the houses across the top of the town. Um, the fascinating history, and this was really revealing the names of the people that were so prominent. I
Right.
think Molina and Kronberg, I think they're still in business. I'm not
They
sure.
are.
They
They're
are.
still
Yep.
going.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but a very influential group.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this. I hope we can see more of this or more related to more available for people, even as they maybe a room someplace in the history center on the Swedish history.
Absolutely. I know our collections manager Erin's on tonight, so I'm sure she's also thinking about what I am is, and we'll definitely we're gonna speak with Elaine further because we need to make sure this does get more documented into our collections for people to learn about, or their families and or just general history. Yeah.
I didn't know the development of those areas in the fairway and this different streets you mentioned, because sometimes the history of those houses turns up in the ads about the houses, and I never saw any of that in any of the properties that I listed. The history of the architecture. It's fascinating history.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Elaine, hi, this is Carol Cameron, your fellow
Right.
of 61 classmate. And I just wondered in your interaction with all of your Swedish relatives, if you had ever come across the Stake family.
Yeah,
They were
I know.
Swedish and they were painting contractors, and
Mhm.
they lived on South Fullerton, like
Right, right.
North Fullerton. And I
Mhm.
don't know how far back the family goes historically, but they were of Swedish descent and very good friends.
Yeah, they were out of the Lutheran Church, and I know of the family. I don't know any of them personally, but you're right. They were uh, really very, very good workers in town.
Mm-hmm. Good. And thank you for this presentation. Truly enjoyed it.
You're welcome.
Yeah. A lot of people saying thank you and how much they learned in the chat too, Elaine.
And when you drive around town now, we go back past the Montclair YMCA, you say, oh, Swedish building, Hillside School, Swedish building, George Innes, Swedish building. And so they left a lot. And also, if you go up from Montclair, if you're on Valley Road, take a peek at George Engstrom's old office building. It was built for Osborne and Marcellus Stone and Lumber Works, and he built it for them. And then when they went out of business, he took this cute little house, and it's behind the Brick Lane restaurant on your way into the Bel Air Apartments in Upper Montclair. So take a little peek at this cute little office building. It's like a little cottage stuck in there, if you're ever up in Upper Montclair there.
Yeah. And to keep in mind, and I know Elaine knows this too, you know, for anyone who are locals or grew up in Montclair, and if you have Swedish heritage or family history, and you have things you want to digitize or figure out a way to preserve with the History Center, reach out to us. And if there's any way we can share that also for the public online, that's a great way for more information to get out there too. And just let us know.
Well, thank you. That was a marvelous program. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. Well,
You're
fantastic.
welcome.
So many new things I myself learned tonight. Really exciting.
And there's a lot more. We went way over time tonight, but I
Well,
had to really keep it down because there's so much more.
well, that just means there's going to be a part two. So we'll do another one.
Time it'll be a book signing.
Yes,
Elaine's
that's
book
what we're saying, a
signing.
book signing. Yeah. Absolutely. I think it sounds like it's needed. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Elaine. So many thank yous coming in through the chat and wonderful comments. I'll make sure I get them all to you via email so you can see everything people wrote for you tonight.
Right.
You know, I think this is an aside. Gunilla Jocelyn, who had a Swedish background, had a collection of postcards that were written by the housewives back to Sweden, and I believe she gave them to the Historical Society. They sort of channeled the history of the people working here, writing back home, and I believe they were written in Swedish. I think she gave them to the Historical Society. That might be interesting to add to your collection.
Yeah, Erin and I will check on that, and we'll let Elaine know, and we can, if they're not digitized, we can get them so and share them. Thank you for pointing that out. Great.
Thank you.
Anything else anyone wants to ask or say before we end for tonight? Well, thank you, Elaine. Wonderful
Thank you.
presentation. Truly.
Thank you.